Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Melbourne Athletic Development Podcast. Today, we're lucky enough to be joined again by Sam Toll, ad physio, elite distance runner, resident shoe expert. Sam, thank you so much for joining us today.
No worries, John. Good to be here again.
We discussed in preparation, obviously, for the Melbourne Marathon, that we would discuss what it's like actually to prepare for a marathon. And particularly because you actually have just done your first marathon and you're obviously in your preparation for your future marathons. And we thought it'd be a good idea to get some understanding of what it was like, one for you, but also for the people that are going to be doing, say, the Melbourne Marathon in a few weeks, what that experience is actually going to be like, and maybe some ideas on things that they need to be aware of, because I think we have in our head sometimes how it's going to pan out. And then often it doesn't necessarily pan out exactly like that. So the first thing that I'll ask you is, one, how did your marathon go?
Well, I guess very much in response to what you just said, there being some things that don't necessarily always go to plan. I definitely had some big, I guess, drawbacks to things that happened both in the lead in the last couple of weeks, but also, I guess, during the marathon itself. But I had a lot of positives that came out of the event as well. So
you did your first marathon, it was July.
It was the Gold Coast Marathon at the start of July.
Yeah, so a lot of our listeners, probably have either done it or are involved in the running, know what the Gold Coast Marathon is. It's typically usually a pretty big target event for most Australians because it tends to be quite fast.
Yeah, it's a relatively fast marathon. It's like not really got very many hills through it. But the other thing is it's probably the highest level of marathon in Australia as well. So it's a gold label event, which attracts a lot of the elite athletes as well as just the actual everyday runner as well. So it's a really cool event to be a part of, and anyone who kind of wants to do a marathon in the middle of next year, it's a great event to be a part of.
Yeah, that's a shout out to the Gold Coast Marathon organisers. Sam's got your ticket of approval.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun to be up there for that sort of weekend. But I think one thing it probably made me realize is there's not necessarily such a thing as like an easy marathon as well. Like the idea of being flat and fast, yeah, that's true, but you still have to run the 42Ks. So
yes,
it's there's no easy one for sure. I guess you got Melbourne coming up soon, which is a little bit hillier, but it's still perfectly capable of running a fast one there as well.
Okay, so tell us how your marathon went, and tell us about a few of those things you mentioned that in the lead up maybe didn't go how you wanted, and on the day, what did that mean, and what did it actually pan out to?
Well, it's quite funny. Like during every build, I think you're expecting a couple of hiccups to come in. If you're expecting a perfect 20 weeks leading into a marathon,
it's probably unlikely, isn't it?
Yeah, I think you're being a bit naive. So there were a couple of things that popped up that derailed me for short periods. I got sick for a week and a half. I had a little.
How much do you think that affected you?
So I got sick twice technically. I'll get to the one that I think derailed me quite a lot, but there was one in the sort of maybe 6 weeks out that meant I maybe didn't get a couple of my bigger weeks of training in.
Yep.
But overall that was kind of relatively manageable. I don't think that one necessarily affected me too much. I probably missed one big session that I would have done. Apart from that, everything else was pretty much on track.
Yep.
And so I kind of went through all of that, and I think it was one of those moments for me leading into Gold Coast where there was a decision I had to make about maybe what was best for my marathon and what was I think best for something that I really wanted to do and good for, I guess, career and good for my general development as a runner.
And what was that?
The opportunity to go overseas and spend 3 weeks in Switzerland.
Yes. Okay. So tell people about that, because you went to Switzerland and did essentially a preparation of some altitude training at St. Moritz. What was that like in itself?
St. Moritz has got to be one of the best places I've ever trained.
It sort of is one of the meccas of distance running, isn't it? People descend from all over the world to St. Moritz over the sort of European summer, and a lot of people prepare there.
There's a reason people do it. It's the scenery is stunning, but it's not just this like what you're looking at. It's the way that it's set up as well. So St. Moritz it's an area in the south of Switzerland. It's kind of near the Italian border. It's at about, I think, 1,750 meters of altitude, which is a bit of a sweet spot, really. I think when you start looking at above 2,000, it can quite heavily impact the ability to put out
Yeah.
good paces in training. But it's still very much high enough to get that sort of altitude benefit. The other thing they've got there is it's like got its own supermarkets, it's got its own track, it's got, recovery facilities as well, and a pool and all this sort of stuff. And then a variety of running routes as well. So you can kind of stick to the lakes that run through the area that are all very flat, as well as going up into the hills that have got, some more challenging terrains. And so from a distance running perspective, it pretty much suits anyone from 8 to 1500 up to the marathon distance because of that variety. So I think that's why it becomes this sort of mecca for people coming in. The biggest drawback is, of course, the fact that it's Switzerland and it's kind of expensive.
You said it was one of those things of you don't know whether it was the best thing for the preparation. Why would that be? Because it seems like for most people, going and doing a prep where they have some altitude in it is a good thing. So what's the potential downside for you other than you mentioned the cost? But
the cost
in the long term, yeah, you get over that.
Yeah, you buy your flights and you go, that really hurt.
That never happened. Yeah,
and then by the time you actually get on the plane, you're not thinking about it at all.
Yeah.
So I think this is probably not actually. I don't think it's as big of an impact, but I'd only done altitude properly once before.
Okay.
So I think in terms of how I know how it affects me, like I'm still experimenting with that a little bit. But to be honest, you don't really get better at that without trialing it.
No.
The probably biggest issue that I had with going to Switzerland at the time that I did was that I arrived in St. Moritz 4 weeks before the marathon. I spent 3 weeks there, and then I had a week to get back to Melbourne and then go up to Gold Coast the following weekend. So it was probably more the travel was one of the bigger things for me that maybe made it less of a beneficial thing. I think if I'd been running a European marathon, like maybe a week after,
you would have been fine.
I would have probably been a lot better.
Well, that's a big thing, isn't it, with travel fatigue? But it's interesting because you hear that a lot of athletes will actually fly in quite close to a marathon.
Something Australians do a lot of.
Yes.
And I think that's an access thing a little bit. Because I think that's one of the big things that's appealing about Gold Coast is that it's like this quite fast marathon that you don't have to travel that far for.
Yeah, it's easy to do.
Yeah. And I think we're actually starting to see Australians start to prioritize things that are a bit easier to travel to. So
like Japan marathons.
Exactly. Yeah. Japan, South Korea, going to those big marathons there rather than going to Europe necessarily because of the travel impact. Same with the States as well. Less people are going to the States unless it's maybe for a major or something like that as well. And that's just a time zone, getting over that jet lag and the way that impacts your body generally. So that definitely impacts things. And for me, unfortunately, when I came back, I thought I was going okay, like a little bit of jet lag, but not too bad. And then on the Tuesday, I started coming down with a bit of a cold. One of the inevitabilities, I think, of air travel is like,
yes.
I wore an N95 mask for the entirety of like my flight. So
you may as well have just had the mask off, man. You should have been licking the seats.
Yeah, exactly.
If you're going to get sick, you may as well have just enjoyed yourself.
It's like 20 hours spent with that mask on, taking it off literally for like 10-minute periods while I ate food. And then, still pulling up with what was realistically quite a mild cold. Like, I think it was the sort of thing I might not even have gotten sick from had I not been affected by jet lag and that sort of time difference as well. But it derailed me for about 2 days in Melbourne. I had one of the worst nights sleep of my life. And
do you think there was anything to do with you being stressed about it?
100% as well. Like, I think all those things sort of come together. Like, I've trained for this event. I decided I was going to do Gold Coast in like November of the year before. I'd spent this period building up to be able to do the training that I wanted to do. I then did the training. I then had gone away. I'd done this because the thing is, the St. Moritz block actually went really, really well.
Okay, that's good. That's positive.
Yeah. I was stoked with the sessions I was putting out. Like, I remember there was this one run I did around there's this airport just kind of outside St. Moritz, and it's where a lot of like the race walkers go and do their big sessions and stuff like that. And it's like a 6K loop, I think, roughly around it. And you're still at 1,700 meters of altitude there. And I did a 35K run around there with like some big like intervals of up to about 5K within it. And I remember I started the session like relatively conservative. I was like, oh, I'm at altitude. I'll adjust the paces slightly to make sure I get through everything. And about halfway through, I was like, I feel awesome. Like,
Good.
Like I'm about 2 weeks into my time there at this point, and I was like, I feel incredible. Like this is great, and I had to keep the reins on a little bit. And I think I finished that session, and I was just like, I'm
on.
I'm in good shape here. Like, and all that stuff that had happened, like I mentioned before, that initial like little blip of sickness before I went away. I wasn't even thinking about that anymore. I was like, nah, I'm ready. I'm ready for this. Like, all I need to do is get this taper right now. Which we'll talk about this a bit later on, I think. But like one of the biggest things I think I've learned is that like you've got to get the taper right, because that lead into the actual event, like give yourself every opportunity to not get sick. Give yourself every opportunity to feel well recovered, and don't chase training in the last 2 weeks, because it's not going to do anything for you. But yeah, I think I was in awesome shape, and I remember that, I think it was that Tuesday night leading into the Wednesday, and I'd woken up at like midnight, just like sneezing, and I couldn't sleep again until about 7 a.m. And I remember just spending like a good 2 hours just thinking like, am I going to race? Like, I don't even know if I don't know if I'm actually going to be able to anymore. And all of this stuff, I was like, why did you fly? Like, you should have just like only gone up for a couple of weeks, and all this sort of stuff that's coming through your head. And, I don't know. I look back on it now and I'm like, oh, it's bad luck. It happens. Like, and I guess the cruelty of the marathon is that like you can't just, it's not like a 1500 where you can go, oh, I was sick last week. It's right, I'll do it in a week's time. It's like you've booked accommodation. The events aren't that frequent.
But it is a factor that probably most people, and now these days people do sign up for runs, but when it's something that you've really invested the time into, like some people would be aware, but obviously like at the Olympics, I get a call from Mia the morning of her race, and she's like, these stupid cardboard beds, I've actually destroyed my neck. Like I've got really bad running. I can't turn my head. And I'm like, oh my God. Like you're meant to be running the Olympics today and you've just broken your neck basically. It's a really interesting thing, I think, for people to understand that like how many things can derail you when you've actually only got one opportunity to pull it off, or you've done all your preparation for something that you've really been aiming for, and then that's the day, and you're like, okay, like small things can derail this really quickly.
Yeah.
Like I said, you're sitting next to someone who's sneezing and you're like, I'm all right, I got my mask on, but maybe you're not. And, you do end up getting sick or a bit run down or whatever it is. It really does have an effect.
Yeah, for sure. Like, I mean, the Olympics is like another thing entirely.
I know, but I'm saying like those things can happen literally on the day.
It's being invested in something like so much. And I think a lot of people probably feel this way about like their upcoming marathons. Everyone's goals are different, and it's like,
well, it's your marathon. Whether you're aiming to, run 4 hours, or you're aiming to run 2:20 or whatever you're trying to do, like you're there to do the best you can do, and you obviously need to, maximize on your own, preparation. And that's why I wanted to ask you about some of these things, because I feel like the messages you can pass on are kind of approachable for anyone who's preparing for a marathon. And yeah, it's interesting to hear you say that, like you can feel you have those moments where you're actually quite scared. You're like, oh no, if I missed my opportunity, I've done all this training and now I'm potentially going to miss out.
Yeah. And I did actually have a conversation like with my coach about what I was going to do. And he was kind of like,
what did he say to you?
Well, his original thought was like, do you think you can still run? And I was like, I don't know right now. Like, because I would have caught him on the Thursday, I think. And I was like, I feel a lot better than I did yesterday, but I'm still not well. And he was like, well, Sunny Coast is in 4 weeks. And I was like, oh.
Yeah, I wasn't aiming for Sunny Coast.
Well, it's also, then life stuff comes into it as well. It's like, I'd have to then get accommodation to go to the Sunshine Coast, get flights. Like I'd already had this trip planned where I was going to go up with a group of people as well. And I was like, I'm not sure whether or not that was actually like a move that I wanted to do, and whether I wanted to just
committed to that idea. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think it's actually very powerful having that singular goal, and suddenly that goal being shifted somewhere else. It was like, I don't want that.
Yeah.
Like, I don't want to go to the sunny coast and do this random marathon. Like, I want to actually do the one that I planned on doing. Um, and so I hit Thursday and I was feeling a little bit better. And on the Friday, I went for this like really short, like 5K jog just to see how I was kind of feeling. And that was the day I was also flying out to the Gold Coast. So I wasn't even sure like what my plans were at that point. I kind of went for the jog and I was like, oh, it was a little bit like congested, but like I actually felt okay. My legs felt pretty good. Like I was like, I think I'm still gonna run this thing, and then I'll see what's gonna happen over the next 2 days as to what my actual race plan is.
Yep.
And so yeah, flew out to the Gold Coast on the Friday night. On the Saturday, I went for another run that was kind of like I chucked in a few little strides at the pace that I intended on running the next day just to see how that felt. And I was like, oh, I might back off what the starting pace that I kind of want a little bit, but I'm going to do this. Like I'm going to run.
Can I
this
ask
marathon.
actually, it's something that I do not know anything about. What's the warm up for a marathon? Or,
so this is something that I've never done before, and it was
like,
bizarre.
we'll get to the warm up actually. And before that, like, what typically are athletes doing in the couple of days leading up? Like, for you, it changed. Well, I assume maybe it changed, but you said the Friday, the marathon's on the Sunday morning. The Friday, you went for an easy 5. And the next day, you went for a jog and did some strides. Would that have been your typical lead-in, or did you end up changing that?
No, I changed it. So
what was the plan originally that your coach had said to you? Okay, this is what we're going to do.
I originally had a session planned for the Wednesday,
which was
I think like 4 by 3 minutes at my intended marathon pace.
Yep.
So it's like pretty short, something that I recover from pretty much instantaneously, but like a little bit of just getting that intensity in that makes you feel like you're not just like sluggish and whatever by the end of the week. So that was supposed to be, I think, on the Wednesday, and then I was going to do. I think I had a day off planned on the Thursday, and then I was going to do. Oh no, the day off was the Friday, and then I was supposed to have an easy jog of like 30 minutes or something on the Thursday, and again on the Saturday, I think 25-minute jog. Like I wasn't going to do very much training at all that week anyway, but it was going to be a little bit.
All right, let's go back to the event itself. You get to Saturday night. You've done some strides. You've done a bit of a jog. What's the decision at that point? You're like, okay, I'm in.
Yeah, I think I decided the moment I finished that run, and I was like, yeah, I'm going to do this.
Yep.
It doesn't matter what it is, but I'm going to become a marathoner tomorrow. I'm going to have done one.
I'm going to step on the line, yeah.
Yeah, I don't really care what it like. And at that point, it was actually a little bit freeing in that like I'd had this like goal that had been almost shifted for me by other people's expectations at certain points in time as well. Like,
in what sense?
Yeah. Oh, well, so when I first decided I wanted to do one, I kind of went in with the mentality of like, I just want to get one on the board that like I can be like proud of, but it's not my goal time for the marathon. Yeah. Like, because I think you hear a lot about people like respecting the marathon distance, understanding that you have to learn the race because it's different to other distance races in the way that it grinds you down, and it's a patience game a little bit more. And so I was thinking about that, and I was like, I want to just get one on the board. I want to run. I think the initial time that I thought about was about 2:25. And I was like, let's get that on there and see what happens. And then as I was like getting into training, I remember having conversations with my coach, having conversations with other people, and they were like, oh, like, surely you're going for under 2:20. And I was like, am I going for under 2:20? Like that wasn't a decision that I had necessarily made, but it kind of became because other people who were at a similar level to me that I trained with for a little while, or even people I was running faster than over shorter distances, I was running maybe a minute faster than the half marathon, were aiming for faster times for their marathon than I was. And so that kind of shifted my mentality. And suddenly in my head, I was aiming for 2:20.
Okay.
And I ended up doing a lot of training at around that sort of pace. Like that session I mentioned in St. Moritz, I think at that point I was like, yeah, I'm going to run 2:20. But that kind of had changed. And then suddenly on the race day, it was kind of like, oh, you know what? All of these expectations that have kind of like that goalpost slowly shifting to get faster and faster and faster. I was like, I don't actually care about that anymore. Like, I just want to go out and run a race that's like, that I can be proud of for tomorrow based on like what's happened over the previous week. So yeah, come Saturday night, I was thinking like I'd gone to the technical meeting for the elite field as well that on the Saturday afternoon, and I talked to a bunch of the pacemakers as well that were there, and there was going to be a pace group for the lead women that was going out. They said they were going to go out at 2:24 pace, and then there was another pacemaker who said he was going to go out at about 2:22, who was leading one of the Japanese guys who was coming over. So I was like, oh, there's probably two groups that I could potentially go with there. Um, and I had another friend who'd gone up who was committed to that 2:22 group, and I was like, I'm going to go with him, like because I know him, I know he's a smart racer. He's not going to push things.
Yeah, he's not going to be silly.
So I was like, I'll follow him, and there was a group I think of about like 6 people who decided to go with that pacemaker.
Well, let me ask you the question then, because obviously you went through that process. What is the process for someone who is, say, picking out a time with how they make that decision? Not obviously I'm sure their training has probably dictated what that is, but how do they then make the decision about which group to go in? Because as you said, sometimes you might be a little bit in between. You know, say if your target time's 3:30 and there's a 3:25 group and a 3:35 group, which group are you going in? What should, and what kind of decisions are you making with that?
Yeah.
Like if you're in between, for instance, are there sort of key criteria that you should use of saying, no, you're probably best to go with the fast one, or maybe start at the slower one, and you should, what's that process like?
Well, I would say race day lesson number 1 for me is
lesson number 1. I've been doing my tips of the week, so Sam's lesson number 1.
Go with the more conservative one.
Okay, why is that?
I think the nature of the way the marathon grinds you down is that the blow up you can experience in the last 5 to 10K exceeds the benefit you get out of going a minute faster through halfway.
Okay. So when people are making their decision, because there will be people, who hopefully listen to this and they're going on between the pace groups. Your suggestion is potentially go with the slower group.
Potentially, yes, and I think specifically if it's one of your first marathons too.
Yes, yeah, we're talking about people maybe preparing for an early part of their career in the marathon.
Think things might be a little bit different if you've done like 7 or 8 of them and you're in between that. They probably have a lot more to say about this and areas of expertise that I haven't experienced yet.
Yeah, this is for deciding on your first marathon.
Exactly right. I think go more conservative because you can
blow up badly.
You can blow up badly.
I like the emphasis there.
So yeah, that would be the first thing I'd say. And so I went to that technical meeting, had decided on that. I should realistically have gone with that slower pace group, I think, that 2:24 group.
Did you talk to your coach about it?
No.
Isn't that the person you're meant to have those conversations with?
Yeah, like it probably was. And I think we'd already talked about like the pace groups, and I think I said I think there's going to be one at around this and around this, and he'd already kind of indicated that he thought like just go with the one that you think you'll be most comfortable in. And because I had that friend who was going in the other one,
you're like, I'm okay here.
I'm okay here, and like in my head I was in 220 shape, so
222 is cruising.
I was like, that's still conservative, right? So did that. In terms of like what I did throughout the day, it was essentially a lot of eating and a lot of resting. Like
on the Saturday,
Saturday. Yeah. So I think, to be honest, that actually extends probably from Thursday, Friday, Saturday.
Well, talk people through that because I'll get to what was your warm up, but what's the eating? What's the process there, and what recommendations do you have for people about the eating in the lead up?
Probably eat more than you think you need, because your goal at that point is to essentially over a period of like 48 hours or so
have a bit of a calorie surplus. Yeah,
exactly right. And it's not just eating like rubbish the whole time. It's like trying to
have McDonald's for 4 days in a row.
Well, was it Usain Bolt ate chicken nuggets before he did his things, and the whole thing? Sprinter. I'll see.
Chicken nuggets are great. Don't shit on chicken nuggets.
But in terms of like, it's essentially high carbs. So my preference with that is actually rice. I've tried both rice and pasta, and I find I actually just tolerate greater amounts of rice better.
Yep.
So like I had a lot of rice in the lead in. I think the meal before, because it was like actually a group meal that we had with the people who were staying together, we did have pasta for that one. But I kind of had already gone pretty heavy on the rice.
So you were happy with that?
Yep. I was pretty happy with how things have been going. And then essentially, just eating plenty of that. I also made sure lots of fluid as well. So plenty of water, a couple of electrolyte drinks on the day before as well, just to put yourself in the best place so that the next morning, if you maybe can't get as much food down as you want, or if you miss a gel or whatever it is,
I
you're
think that's a
feeling little
really
bit.
key thing to say of like, and it's a message I think for people first timers, I think the stress, and you can explain this, but the stress of actually setting up for the days, a lot of people may think that they need to do a lot of that on the day. And I think the advice would definitely be is like, don't get too worried about that. As long as you've been in that calorie surplus and hydrating really well in the days leading up, if you can't get a lot of food down, because obviously maybe it's an early start time or you're not someone who eats a lot before a race, don't panic, because your body's still actually holding a lot of that hydration and also the nutrition from the 3 or 4 days leading in.
Yeah, absolutely. If you've prepared yourself well, like I would actually say the majority of people probably have a terrible night's sleep the day before.
Yeah.
And
And so don't be surprised with that. And typically, even, on my end from coaching sprinters, we had a lot of issues with that, even people having bad sleep just because of, jet lag and stuff like that. And it really didn't affect performance. In fact, we had people running, personal bests off, basically a couple of hours sleep.
yeah, it's like prioritize your sleep and your nutrition and your hydration in those like 3 days leading in. And if you tick all of that off well, on the day you could get away with a really poor night's sleep. Eat something before you run, but like it doesn't necessarily have to be that much if you've done the rest of it really well. Yeah.
What did you eat on the morning of?
I had 2 pieces of white toast with honey and banana. Like
Yeah, so stuff that's pretty easily digestible.
exactly right. And
You,
then
you didn't have steak for breakfast?
yeah, just pure protein. Yeah, that with some chips and a McFlurry as well.
That would have gone down well.
Yeah. No, I had a pretty standard breakfast. I've like again, even though this is my first marathon, I've had a lot of races that have been early in the morning, and I know that works well for me, and I don't feel full off that.
Well, I think that's something to practice too, because, it's something that a lot of people, I think, don't necessarily think about too much. But I think for longer races, it's really important that you have practiced eating what you're going to eat. A lot of people say, "Oh, I've practiced eating." Okay, but did you practice eating what you actually plan on having on that day?
Yeah.
Because that might be different. If you normally eat toast and then all of a sudden you decide you can have Wheat Bix, it's a different thing. So make sure that you've been eating, toast the whole time, and it's not really a change for you.
Yeah, that's right. It's quite funny. Like when I was in St. Moritz, there was one day where like I knew everyone else was training at like 10 o'clock, but my session was completely different to that anyway. And I was like, no, you know what? This is like my last big marathon session. It's the one I was talking about at the airport. And I was like, no, I'm going to practice this as I would. I was already kind of a little bit jet lagged and just recovered really from it, but I was still waking up pretty early because I tried to maintain that. And so I woke up at like 6, had breakfast, and I was out the door at 7. And it wasn't crazy early, but it was as early as I kind of needed to do things. And it still felt like it got me into a routine of I woke up, I ate, and I went. I didn't, sit on my phone for an hour or like.
And it's important to practice that, because I think the time of the day can be a really big factor. I have this discussion a lot with athletes of, especially for the track stuff, the events are often much later than what you would normally train. So it's a bit weird because, there's often sometimes competitions we have where it's like, you're racing nearly at 10 o'clock at night. And if you've been going to bed at 10 o'clock at night, you're ready to shut down, not to race.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think it's the same thing. If you normally wake up, you're someone who wakes up at 8 o'clock in the morning, not that that's super late or anything, but your race starts at 7.
You're supposed to be an hour into your marathon.
Yeah. Your race starts at 7 and you normally get up at 8. Like, you need to practice that as well.
Yeah. So that was like an active decision, and the sort of thing that I would encourage lots of people to do is get yourself ready to what it feels like to be up at that time and to be doing things at that time as well.
And that's something that, like, I'm sure a lot of people are aware of that and they're doing that, but there's still a couple of weeks until I'm expecting this episode's going to be out a couple of weeks before the marathon. You can actually start to practice that in the lead, and spend the next couple of weeks actually getting up at the time you're going to be up, and as you said, do things that you would normally be if you're going for your run. Well, okay, I'm up, I've eaten, I'm going to go and run. I'm going to do the session I'm supposed to be doing, and what I'm going to eat, I'm going to practice that, and I'm going to be out the door, as you said, at 6:30 or whatever it is.
Yeah.
And do that at least a couple of times.
Yeah, exactly right. So that was, I think that's a really key thing for people to do to feel comfortable on the day as well.
What time was your start time?
I can't remember if it was 6 or 7. I think it might have been 6 actually.
6 a.m.
It was quite early. Yeah.
So what time are you up?
I think 4? I woke up at 4. Yeah.
And did you practice that in the lead-in?
Not 4. I think I had a few, because we did a lot of training sessions starting at 7 o'clock, and we had to be down at kind of Albert Park, which for me takes about like 30 to 45 minutes to get down to. So I was kind of waking up at 5:30 for a lot of those ones. It's definitely different. I think the other thing with Gold Coast as well is that like conditions compared to Melbourne were very different realistically as well. So, if you're doing a session at 7 o'clock in the morning in Albert Park in June,
it's very different.
It's very different to being in Gold Coast at that same time of day. So I think we had a bit of a trade-off there where we didn't want it to be so cold as well. But then as well, I had St. Moritz that kind of played in with that. So it was a bit scattered from that perspective. But
I think it's something to be aware of, because if you never ever get up at 4:30 and you're going to be, if you normally go to bed at 4:30 and you're getting up at 4:30 for the race, it's a very different proposition.
It's actually conversations I've had with a couple of people I help with their programming. Is like, some of them love to get out on their like Saturday mornings and do their long runs at like 11 o'clock. And they were complaining about the fact that they were going to have to do it at 7 o'clock for what was the one in Run Melbourne in July.
Yes.
And I remember just being like, just practice it.
Yeah.
Like, get up earlier. Like, you can't do all of your runs in the afternoon and then expect to perform at your best first thing in the morning.
Yeah.
Like,
you actually have to practice it. It is an interesting thing. And it might not actually fit with some people. Some people's rhythms are different. Some people are morning people. Some people are night people. So it's a really interesting thing. But
you can't control it on race day. So like, you're going to have to do it at some point. You're better off having practiced it at least a few times. And then it also gets you thinking about your nutrition and things like that first thing in the morning. Because it's one thing to say, I just get up and have breakfast at 6 a.m. But if you wake up and you're like, I'm not hungry, so what are you going to do then? Are you going to make yourself feel ill by taking in food that you don't want? Or are you going to have practiced that and know what you can tolerate because you've done it like 4 times beforehand?
Yes. Yeah.
Nutrition practice waking up, and that way, you can kind of be ready for the actual day. And also you won't feel so mentally derailed when things go wrong as well, because things will go wrong. You'll sleep like terribly. One thing with the Gold Coast as well is like there's the tram that takes you from kind of like Broad Beach and Surfers Paradise up to where the start line is in, I think it's called Southport, I think it's the area. And that tram, like if you didn't get on like prior to Broad Beach, you couldn't get on it. It was just full of people. And so there were people like panicking like,
I need to be on this tram,
running to get to the start line. And for a lot of people, the marathon's 42K, they're not doing like a proper warm-up or anything. It's literally like, that's the most distance that they'll ever cover, and they need to get it done that day. And they're doing like a 3K jog to get to the start line. And I think things like that, if you've practiced and you know what those sorts of like, it's harder with an event like that because you kind of don't know it until you've done it.
Yes.
But being calm in those situations, because you'd be like, all right, it's okay. I've woken up plenty of time. I've gone and I know everything else is kind of, all my other ducks are in a row. So it doesn't matter if that one's run off. Like, I'll be okay.
In terms of, you mentioned the warm up there. So take us through your warm up. What was your warm up? You're up at 4.
Yeah.
You eat.
Yep.
And then what time are you getting down to, the warm-up area? What time are you starting to warm up, and what are you doing?
Well, I mentioned the tram because that was one thing that did actually happen to me. I was staying in Main Beach, which is a little bit closer to the start line than Surfers. So I think it was like a 2.5 kilometer walk from the start line. And I remember I arrived at the tram stop. It would have been maybe 5 or something like that. And I looked at it and it was just like already full. And I was like, I'm not getting on that tram. So I committed to it at that point. I'm just going to walk to the start line. And so I'd done kind of like I'd left enough time. So I had about a 2.5K walk. But I remember just thinking to myself, all right, so that's come out of the amount of time you can spend just kind of like chilling out in the core room before you go. So I remember when I arrived, I was like, all right, get my stuff off, get warming up straight away. So for me, they had this like setup where the call room was in like the swim center, and they had like this. Basically, people were jogging around this 50-meter pool. So that was the
That's
warm up area.
ridiculous for a marathon.
Yeah, so you were running. There's about maybe like 30 people just running laps of this pool in the middle of this swim center.
Okay.
It's outside for one, I guess at least, but it was so bizarre rocking up and just like being like, oh, so that's what we're doing, okay, and just taking off my tracksuit and just going. So I did, I think maybe 7 minutes of jogging around there with all of my stuff on, so that I actually felt warm.
Yeah.
Because I feel like that was my priority. It was just like getting my muscles warm. I didn't need to do the sort of length of warm up that I would typically do.
Get tissue temperature high. Yeah.
Exactly right. And then I prioritized doing like my drills and things that would actually make me feel like I was a bit bouncier and switched on. So that was kind of the way I did it. And then one thing that I didn't realize was that the actual start line was about like 600 meters from the
swim center.
Because I've been that little bit behind on where I thought I was going to be, and I hadn't counted this in. I was one of the last people to kind of like leave, and suddenly I looked down and I was like, the race starts in 10 minutes, and I can't see the start line. And there was just like this sea of people as well, because all of the other marathoners have already like started lining up now in their various waves, and I can't actually see where the start line is.
Oh God!
And I was like, and there were other people with me still. Like I knew that I wasn't alone, and I would make it, but I was like, I don't know where I need to get to. And I remember doing some of my strides, and I was like extending them out a little bit to. Usually I do them for probably like 60 to 80 meters. And I think a few of them were like all out 100 to 120. Because I was
trying to get a little bit further down towards the start line.
Exactly right. And I eventually arrived, and I actually had loads of time. But I think it was a really weird warm up, because it felt like simultaneously like really short, but that I was always short on time as well, and a little bit frenetic.
I think that's something that's a really key thing for you for preparing for your first sort of major race, like a marathon. Allow time. Like I think it's a big one that I notice even with my athletes. I am real stickler for punctuality. And it's not because I just like being a pain in the ass, which I do like being a pain in the ass, but it's not the only reason. It's because when you have these major events, this is what happens. And things go wrong, and you're not used to where you got to be. You haven't maybe been to this, as you said, this call room before. You haven't been to this event. And you actually need to make sure that you've got a little bit of buffer. So, one thing that I would say to people preparing for their first sort of major race like a marathon is actually allow buffer times. We always, even in, say, it sounds really silly, but in the warm-ups, we always buffer in time to go to the toilet. Because the last thing you want to be doing is thinking, I don't have time to go to the toilet, but the race is about to start, or I've got to be in the call room, or I've got to come out of the call room and I haven't actually gone to the toilet.
This is one of those things that actually made me a little bit later. That was part of the reason I was one of the last ones to go, is because I finished my warm-up and kind of like taken off my stuff, and I was like, oh, I actually need to go to the bathroom. And I knew I was going to need to go. Like, I knew that I had to go. But yeah, I kind of did that. And then when I went back out, that's why I was one of the last ones, because everyone else had already shifted whilst I was in there. And I was only in there for 2-3 minutes or something. But everyone else had left, because it was like, they just said, all right, we're all going now. And then suddenly it was a call of, all right, last call for the marathoners. I was like, what?
Yeah, what's going on?
Where did everyone go?
Yeah. And these are the things that you have to kind of buffer in. And often, genuinely, like when we often write out a warm-up plan for people, it's time scaled to sort of, say like, okay, start your warm-up. You need to have, these drills done by this time, the spikes on. But we often put like, okay, last runs now, call rooms here, you've got 7 minutes, and that's go to the toilet time.
Yeah.
And the funny thing is, if you know the venue, you tend to decide where you're going to place that and how quickly, like, or how much time you need there based on where the toilets are.
Yeah, which toilet has the shortest line usually. And
yeah, like those are the things you have to consider. So if you're someone who knows they're going to need to go to the toilet, like some people they don't really worry about that. But if you've done races before, you're like, okay, I'm definitely going to need to go to the toilet. Work out, and it's something that you look at for the people who haven't done the marathon before or haven't done a major event. In the information that you get, probably in your confirmation emails, they have site maps. And what you need to do is make sure that you have checked where, say, the bathrooms are. And as you said, maybe keep in mind where, an alternative is, because the most obvious bathroom is probably the one that everyone's going to go to. If it's right next to the start line, that's the one everyone's going to want to go to right before the race.
Yeah.
And you might get caught out stuck in a line while the gun goes.
I mean, this applies to pretty much every event, not just the marathon on the
5K,
day as well.
10K.
But I actually recall, like, I think it was maybe 2017 or 2018, I was supposed to do the 10K at Melbourne Marathon. And I parked, like, I didn't have, like, an elite entry at that point. I kind of just had bought a normal one. I'd parked my car at the MCG in Yarra Park. And my plan was to do my warm-up, go to the car where I'd have left all my stuff, go and get my my shoes out, and then go down to the start line. And I remember finishing my warm up and being like, I desperately need to go to the bathroom. And then I went down to where the standard bathrooms were, and the line was like, there were like there were like 10 toilets or something, and there were about like
1,000 people,
1,000 people lined up. And I was just like, I'm not going to make that. So like, I was lucky that I'd done a lot of running in that area, and so I knew where like another little public toilet was. So I kind of like ran off and did that. But I remember getting back and I was like, that
could have been a disaster.
Awful.
Yeah.
So yeah, regardless of your event, toilet time.
But these are things you don't think of. But I think for a major event particularly, like, it's something you need to be considerate of.
And think about how you're traveling there as well. Like, so if you know that to get to the event on the day, you're going to catch the train into Flinders Street Station and then walk down to the start line, use the toilets in Flinders Street.
Yeah.
Like, don't rely on the one that is right next to the start line, because that's the one that everyone's going to want to use. Things like that. Yeah.
They're funny things. So you've done your 7 minutes, you've done your strides, you've done your drills.
Yeah.
All right, take us through some of the race.
So yeah, it's quite funny standing on the start line. Like Rob Di Castello does this like ridiculous speech where he's like, the marathon starts at 30K. Like, you are marathoners. People in Athens die for you. All this random stuff. It was so. At first I didn't know who it was. Making out like you gladiators. Yeah, literally. At first I didn't know who it was, and I was like,
shut up, mate.
What's going on? And then I was like, oh, it's Rob Di Castello. I'll let him have this. Like, he's one of our fastest ever marathoners. We'll give it to him. And so that kind of happened. I was kind of like pretty hyped up at this point, because like, I think, like I said, on the Wednesday, I wasn't even sure if I was running. And so on the Sunday, I'm like, I'm here. I actually feel okay. And I've made it to the start line. I've got everything I need. Because this is another thing that's, know what your nutrition plan is, of where you're going to carry things and where you're going to pick stuff up. So I had some drinks tables that I had.
We'll talk about that.
Water attached to, but I also had my gels in my pockets as well, because I had some little backup ones.
So that's good. That's a perfect tip. When you actually start the race, make sure that if you're going to be having gels, or you're going to have things that you're going to be consuming on you, you need to make sure that you've got them prior. You're not going to be able to run back to your bag and get it. So make sure you could, because typically as well, for people that are in some of the bigger waves, like, there's thousands of people. It's not just, you're not just lined up as if like, oh, I can just go over there and do this. Like, it's like
herding cattle. It's just like seas of people, and you won't be running until you've shuffled across the start line. So make sure you got everything planned before you go. So I had like, I think maybe 4 gels like in the little like small pockets of my shorts, and I knew that I was only going to have to take 2 of those ones, because the rest were like strapped to the bottles I put out on the course. But yeah, so like, I'm there. I know everything's with me. I'm ready to go. We start, and the first thing that happens is I had these Kenyan women next to me, and I know that my race plan is I'm supposed to be ahead of them, because
they take off, don't they?
They took off so fast, and I knew who was pacing the lead women. And they were kind of like standing next to me, and I hear one of them go, they've gone out very quick. And so the lead women are taken off, and these pacers who are getting obviously paid to be in front of them are like, well, we have to get in front of her.
Yeah.
And so the group that I knew was supposed to be behind me was suddenly in front of me. And in my head, I was like, wait, do I go out? What do I do here? Do I go out a bit faster, like to stay in front of them, or do I just sit with them? I can't see my pacemaker. I don't know where that person is. Like, I was right next to him at the start line, and suddenly he's disappeared. And I did eventually find him, but it was like well back from where the lead women were.
Yep.
And so for the first like 6 or 7K of the race, in my head, I'm like, I don't know what to do. Like, we're behind the pace group that I need to be, but they've gone out too quick. So they're actually running the pace I want to be doing.
All right. So on that, because obviously this is something that can go wrong. Like, there's so many people around and people go out and do weird things. So if the pace isn't what you expect, what are your ideas? Like, what are you thinking at that point? What do you do?
Well, I think what I should have done and what I did was slightly different
Okay,
things.
what should you have done?
What I should have done is been patient, accepted the fact that I was actually running at the pace I wanted to be, and bonus, I actually had probably 10 more people in front of me than blocking things, and I could run at a pack bigger than what I
Are
intended.
you saying, I know you're on pace because of your watch? Is that
The watch, but also like, so I didn't have kind of like the pace actually on the whole time, but I had like the watch face on, and I knew the splits I had to hit through certain bits. So through the 5K marker, and you can rely on this stuff at events like Gold Coast because they're very on it in terms of where the actual markers are. But I knew what I needed to do at 5K, and I kind of knew what group I needed to be in. But it did panic me when I first started.
Well, and that's the thing I think for people to be aware of is people do silly things, right? So they'll go way faster or way slower than they'd planned. So you can't really get caught up in what other people are doing. If you know your pace, say you've got your watch going and you're on that, even if as I said, most of the pacemakers who are being paid to do it should be on pace. But if they're not, don't panic or don't think, oh, my mate who was meant to be running at my pace is now ahead of me. You actually just need to stick to what your plan is.
Well, the reason like I knew that we were going fast, that they'd gone faster, is because eventually I did end up next to the guy who was supposed to be doing our pace group, and he just said, "No, they've gone out like quite fast. We're supposed to be a little bit. They're actually going faster than what we intend on doing." And so we've got to kind of like control ourselves through here. It's also a very strange experience, and it's something I haven't had before, where I'm like able to have a chat in the first part of the race, like because
the pace is comfortable enough.
The pace is so comfy, like it feels slow. It feels like like a tempo. It's not like I'm coming from doing a whole bunch of track racing, and even when you're doing tens and halves, like that pace feels very different to what the marathon pace feels.
Yeah, you can see it's always funny because obviously like when there's a 10K on the track, like it doesn't look like people are going that hard, but you can always tell that the pace is decent because they're concentrating. You can see that they're like, no one's looking around, like unless it's, sometimes you see that with, the 5K at major events, it's a heat or whatever, people look around, but it's really clear that people are generally concentrating, like they're following each other, they're watching what's going on. And in the marathon, it's not really like that. You can see people kind of looking around, looking at each other.
I've never had my head going like that in a race before. Like having to actually being like really well thinking about what's happening around you. Most of the time, I think I've like been more reliant on like instincts almost. Like you see something happen,
see a gap or whatever. Yeah,
and I think that actually had a negative impact on me, which is the next thing I was going to say. Is I think like as that was happening in my head, I was like, well, I mean, they've gone out too quick, but I've got to be at the front of this pack, so I'm ready for when like the move does come, because they're not going to go at this pace for the whole thing. I've got to be ready for when it happens. And realistically, it's very easy to respond to like a move in a marathon group. It doesn't take like that long to get back onto someone. But I think I was just kind of like really impatient, and I was like waiting for it to happen. And then it's quite funny. There was another guy. He's a South Australian guy called Adrian Potter, who's a better track runner than I am, who was also doing his first marathon, and he was right next to me and part of this pace group we were supposed to go with. And as we went to we were both kind of like hanging on the front of this group, he goes, all right, they're starting to slow down. They're starting to slow down. And I was like, oh, okay. Well, we'll probably go around them at some point. And then he was like, oh, no, they're slowing down quite significantly. And suddenly we were in front of the pacers.
Okay.
And so there was this little break group of like three of us. And I remember getting out to the front, and I'm like now sitting in front of the lead women. And I was like, oh, this is where I'm supposed to be. And in my head, it's like, yeah, this is where you're supposed to be. But suddenly I'd lost the protection of about 10 people in front of me. And that basically was how it then played out for the next sort of, there's a turnaround at 18 kilometers where we went from being essentially running into a headwind into running with a tailwind. And during that period, like myself and Adrian more or less shared the lead. During that, there was a period where our pacemaker was in front of us, but the Japanese guy actually dropped off really early.
Okay.
And he was like, that's my pay. The guy who's paying me to be here. So
I've got to go with him. Yeah.
And so we were just like kind of there was another guy in the group as well, but there was like maybe 3 or 4 of us who were just kind of like sharing that lead through. And it's weird because you feel really good because it's so early in this race and you're like, this pace is comfortable. I don't mind taking a bit of the lead. And then,
Well, okay, is that a tip that people should be aware of? Is that if it feels comfortable, it's actually probably the right pace?
yeah, I think tip number 2.
Yeah.
lesson 2.
Lesson 2. I use tips, you do lesson.
Sorry. Lesson 2 that I learned is, and this is like so cliche and something probably people have heard a lot, but like be patient.
Yeah.
Like, because I wasn't. Like, I think my track instincts take over when I should have realized that I wasn't racing on the track. And like, I wasn't going to miss like a move where maybe a second really, really matters. It was going to be okay if like I saw the move and, oh, think about it. Yeah, I should be there and then go because I've got the time. I had 30 kilometers left to run. Like, I had plenty of time. And so like we hit that turnaround and I remember I was like, oh, I still feel really good.
So this is 18K.
We're at 18K now. And I remember going through halfway and I think I just ticked over 71 minutes. And I was like, oh, sweet. We're on pace here. I'm feeling good. I'm running with a tailwind now as well. This would be great. I'd hit all of my, like, through this first part of this race as well, I'd hit all my nutrition, which another kind of thing is like take your nutrition before you need it and have a plan for that because
so that's lesson number 3.
Yeah. You're not gonna feel, if you feel like you need it, it's too late.
Yep.
You should never feel like you need it. But I'd hit all of that stuff. I'd had my gel, got it down well. I'd had my drink, got it down well. And yeah, did the turnaround at 18, was running back up towards, back down through Broadbeach. And I felt awesome. Like, I remember looking at the split that I had going through from like, I think 21 to 20, 21 and a half, because I lapped it manually at that point rather than waiting for the 5K split. And then looking at what I went through, like the 26K marker, and I was like, oh, I'm flying. I'm feeling great. And because you had the tailwind behind you, I was like, oh yeah, if we run a couple of like slightly too fast ones, it's probably okay. And then suddenly I hit 28K and I was like, I feel like I'm slowing down. And it wasn't like an aerobic thing. It wasn't like that feeling I've had at the end of races where I'm just gassed and I can't go any faster. It was just like, I think I'm getting slower. And like, I don't feel like I'm working harder, but I just feel like I'm getting slower. And I couldn't control it. And then so all of a sudden, like from 28K to 30, and this is the other slightly grim thing about Gold Coast, is that you go past the finish line at 30K and then you do the last 12Ks and out and back. So I go past and I'm like, I think I'm done. Like I can't go faster than this. Like I want to. I'm not breathing heavy, but every time I try and go faster, it feels like I'm about to trip over. And so I look down at the pace I'm doing. I'm like, oh, I'm still rolling around at about 345 to 350 pace. Like it's not crazy slow. It's slower than the 320s I was running 3Ks ago. But like this will still get me like a 225-ish. Like that's okay. Like you've been sick. Everything else has kind of happened. And then we were running up and we hit the turnaround at 36K. And I'm just like, oh, I feel like I'm done. Like my goalposts have just changed rapidly. It's just like shifted from that 222 to 225. I slowed down a little bit more. So I'm like, oh, like I'm going to run on 230. It'll be fine. And then I hit this headwind as we turn around as well. And so I've got I've got 6Ks running into this headwind and my pace dropped from like 350s down to like 420s, 430s, which is like slower than I jog a lot of the time.
Yeah.
And that like last 6K, and what was hilarious is like Adrian, the exact same thing happened to him. Like we're like going back and forth like at our jogging paces, like having these like half conversations. And yeah, he's just like, oh yeah, you'll kick home now. And I'm like, yeah, we'll survive.
We'll see,
yeah. And so like, yeah, the whole like last 12K, pretty much from 30K through till 42, I was in like survival mode basically, but like a really like conscious survival mode. It wasn't that like
you weren't blowing up, but you're just like, I can't go faster.
I just can't go faster than this. And I think like it was probably that accumulation of like the travel fatigue, the sickness, and just basically my legs just not being ready for a marathon. I think I could have got it away with it over a 10 or a half even. But over that marathon, that just like they were just like, nah, you've used all our energy. You know, we were ready in St. Moritz 2 weeks ago, but now that what's happened over the past week means you're not ready anymore. Like your legs needed another 5 days and then maybe we could have gone. And so kind of I was just like processing all of this, but it was actually a really interesting thing that happened was that like
so what did you end up running?
I ran 232, which was about 10 minutes off the goal pace that I kind of had on the day going in, and the pace that I went through halfway in as well. So a fair way off that. But I think by the time I finished, I was honestly just proud of myself for getting to the finish line.
Of course.
Because I was just like, that was probably the hardest 12K you'll ever run in your life. And you got through it. So I think I came out of it actually. All of my friends who kind of knew what I wanted to run were like walking on eggshells around me, just being like, "Oh, it's gonna be so pissed off himself. Like he didn't get there. Like we all know what he wanted to run. He's gonna be really upset." And I was like,
"This is good."
I was just kind of like, I processed that 5Ks ago. Like when I turned around into that headwind, I had a moment of, and then I was good. Like I was just like, we're gonna get to the finish line. I finished. Awesome. I didn't run as fast as I wanted. I know what went wrong. Cool.
In terms of, so wrapping up, what's the lesson that you take out of, not necessarily hitting the time? What are the things that you take out of those factors that you think that you could have influenced, or do you think it was all just to do with the preparation of that last week or so?
I definitely think like I would have run faster if my week had been different that final week leading in. I don't think there's any doubting that, but the main lesson I kind of took out from it is I think the marathon is really hard. And
it's that obvious, Sam.
It is, but like I actually think it's something that more people need to probably accept now, because there's this big trend of people like doing things because of the like without training for them properly. And this idea that like it's just great to get through things. And I think the actual like difficulty of running a marathon is actually being lost in that a little bit. You see people who are like, oh yeah, like I saw someone recently who's doing like 10K runs a week, and they're like, I'll see if I can get through my marathon on this. It's like, you're not even running a marathon a week. And it's like, yeah, you might get through it, but like I feel like it kind of takes away from how hard it is even for people who've trained really, really hard for it.
Well, I always, and I cop lots of criticism for this, but like I don't see that there's the same level of achievement in just completing it. I think if you set yourself a target and you really go for it, that's very different to just saying like, oh, I just plodded along and I finished it.
Yeah.
And I always think that people should set themselves the challenge of wanting to do it at their highest level of capability.
Yeah.
And that's not to say that, 4 hours might be the fastest anyone ever runs, but I don't have a huge amount of respect if that same person runs a 5-hour marathon, because it's like, well, you can run 4 hours. Why are you running 5?
Yeah, I could have run a 3.5-hour marathon in training as part of just
like, going for a run.
Yeah, that's not like I agree with that.
That's the challenge: is set a target that's difficult for you.
Yeah,
and go after it, and don't be scared to take on that challenge.
Yeah, I think that going after it's really important as well. Like I have a lot more respect for someone who like wakes up early, gets their like training in before work continuously for like half a year in the build up for one of these events than someone who just decides to rock up on the day.
Yeah.
Because they might get the most out of themselves on the day, but they haven't actually prepared for it. They haven't actually done it.
I don't think that's the process of what's impressive about doing a marathon is
the discipline.
Discipline of it, yeah.
Yeah. So like the big positives I took out of it, one thing is I got through my marathon build healthy, like in terms of my actual like body. I'm stoked with that.
That's cool. Yeah, that's always nice when you get through and you're like, okay, I actually I'm healthy.
Yeah. And then that getting through it is in itself like the achievement, and like for me, knowing that I can put myself into a point where like I could so easily have dropped out at 30K. I was next to the like that finish line.
Yeah, you could just walked off.
I could have just walked off, and no one
should have just popped out again. And
yeah, just got on the other side and run like 2 flat or something. But like I got a lot of like self-belief and confidence out of the fact that I knew that when things got as hard as they did, I still pushed myself to go as fast as I could. Even though I was jogging, by the end of it, I was like, I know that I couldn't have gone any faster on the day.
Yeah.
With the way that first 30K popped out.
And so when's the next marathon?
Well, I'm going to do Gold Coast again next year. I think my personality is one where it's like, I didn't get that right.
I want to go back and fix it.
Because even though there were like things that I couldn't control that affected me in the end, there were also mistakes I made during the race. Like I mentioned, not being patient and like those sorts of things that I know that I could have done better. Like I'm going to do them better next time. And so like I'm actually really excited for that. I'm going to take a bit of time over the summer to do more track racing and things like that as well, because like I do still like that side of the sport as well. But I know that come July next year,
You're going to be
I'm
ready.
going to do it again. And like, I know the lessons I've learned, and I'm going to make sure that what I can control, I do right next time.
Yeah, fantastic. Sam, thank you so much for sharing your experience in your first marathon. We do very much hope that our listeners get something out of it, especially if those people are preparing for their first marathon at Melbourne in a couple of weeks' time. Thank you so much for joining us. Please like and subscribe on any of our social media channels, and share these podcasts if you found this useful. Thank you, Sam.
No worries at all.